Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Steve Johnson, happen to be the current president of the Albert Ellis Institute, and I'm very excited about getting to interview this young man, Dr. Gur-Aryeh. And he has a fascinating job that we want to find out about. And then also I'm going to look at where, if anywhere, REBT plays a role in what he does. But Shoval, can you kind of give us a little bit about yourself, including what your current position is and how you got there and the kind of work that you're doing now?
Sure. So I am currently, I'll start, where I am now and sort of backtrack. I'm currently the director of the mental health department and the director of the opioid treatment program at a county jail here in New Jersey. I've been here for the last 4 years. Prior to this, I was the mental health director at a different county jail. And before that, I was a staff psychologist in the New Jersey State prison system. And I also have a private practice that I've maintained for a while. And yeah, that's so these days I'm working in correction psychology.
In correction psychology. Great. Great. And so what was your educational background moving
Right,
into
right. So
this?
I'm from Los Angeles originally. I went to UCLA for my bachelor's degree in psychology. I was very, very fortunate to have opportunities to take graduate classes while in undergrad and do research. And I became very early on very interested in cognitive behavioral psychology,
Mm.
cognitive behavioral therapy, the theories underpinning cognitive behavioral theory, cognitive theory, behavioral theory. I did research in behavioral psychology and understanding conditioning, operant conditioning, classical conditioning. And with that background, I ended up moving to the East Coast and doing graduate school, a joint master's and PhD in psychology at Fordham University.
Oh, at Fordham. I didn't know that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I first met you at the Albert Ellis Institute there in New York City. So how did you
Yes.
go from UCLA all the way to the Albert Ellis Institute across the world?
Uh, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but one of the things I realized was as much as interested as I was in cognitive behavioral therapy, and at that point, by the time I got the Albert Ellis Institute, which was in 2015, by that point, I had already counted myself as a cognitive behavioral therapist.
Right.
I was working professionally at that point with my master's degree. But I realized that as much as I knew about cognitive behavioral therapy, it really wasn't enough. And I realized that I needed more of a foundation and a better understanding of the tools. And in just doing research into Beck and Ellis and the various camps, REBT really spoke to me. Um, and so I enlisted, and I was very fortunate at that point in my life. I was able to afford, both time wise and financially, the to do the primary and advanced certification programs at the institute.
Good deal. And I want to find out if at all you use REBT where you are now in a jail, but can you help before I do that? I mean, like many of us, we're not quite sure what the difference is between a prison and a jail, and how
Yeah.
would that difference impact what you do?
Yeah, I think for most people, the only way you would know is if you spent time in a jail, and certainly many people do. Hopefully, nobody viewing this, but people do. People do. People end up in jail, and they learn very quickly the difference. So, generally speaking, in the country, the difference between a county jail and a state prison is that people in a county jail are pre-adjudication, so they've been arrested and charged with something, but they have not gone through the judicial process yet. And then if they are convicted, and sentenced to less than a year, they will typically serve that time in the jail. And if they're convicted and sentenced to more than a year, they will serve that time in a state prison. In New Jersey, we have legislation that was passed in 2017 referred to as bail reform. What that basically means now is whoever is charged with a crime, whether they did it, didn't do it, they are homeless, or a CEO of a company with $1 million mansion, everybody charged with a crime starts off in the jail. And then a great many of them will be released within 48 hours. Others will stay.
I see. So we're not talking years and years of therapy here that you would be doing. In fact,
Correct.
what would be the kinds of, kind of the typical issues or conditions or whatever that you would be treating somebody there in the county jail?
Right. So the services that we provide let me backtrack. The treatment model in a county jail will depend on the contract between the county and the vendor. Most county jails, not all, but most county jails will hire a private company to come into the jail and provide medical services, mental health services, dental, and so forth. And so the contract that the county signs with the vendor will dictate the level of staffing in the mental health department and the nature of services. So in our county jail, our contract it doesn't include the model for providing ongoing counseling. We'll do brief counseling, but we typically do not do ongoing counseling and therapy for any of the individuals incarcerated there, which really makes it's ideally suited for REBT because we're able to really, I think, make an impact in someone's life in a brief amount of time.
Okay. I'd like to dig into that, but before that, um, I teach and psychotherapy and now work, volunteer once a year to teach in a maximum security prison,
Hmm.
and all with men. And I find that so many of them have trauma, so many of them have addictions, but those are longer term kinds
Right.
of issues. So I'm assuming, given they're in prison, you're not going to have time to kind of unpack those issues, right?
Exactly. And we wouldn't want to if somebody comes in on Monday and they end up getting released on Tuesday, when we see them Monday, we don't want to start trying to unpack,
Yeah.
their history of trauma and abuse and so forth. And then the next day they're released to the four winds, and here you go. We've now, dredged up all of these really painful memories. So, right, we typically want to steer clear from getting into the weeds in therapy about their trauma history. But you're absolutely right. So many of them have a history of trauma.
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, what kinds of issues are you working on with these individuals, and how do you incorporate REBT into that?
So a simple question, but a very complex answer that I could make very long-winded. So I'll try not to. I mean, it really, I might address any number of problems. I mean, the range is I don't want to say limitless, but one of the recurring issues that I find myself talking to the inmates about is this masturbatory thinking, as Al would call it. Um, this notion that that officer has to respect me,
Ah,
right? And if he doesn't respect me, then and they're off to the races.
yeah.
And it's such fertile ground for really trying to help them understand that thinking creates so many more problems on an emotional level, on a physical level, because if they feel disrespected by an officer and they have that thinking, he has to respect me, well, then he obviously doesn't respect them. They are filled with anger and rage. They act out. They get an institutional charge for breaking the rules of the facility. They end up on disciplinary status. They don't get to use the phone. They don't get commissary. They don't get let out of their cell as much. So there are real world consequences for them that kind of derive from that really distorted way of thinking.
So in fact, if I got you right, is that demandingness, and the must that's there about the demand on how that officer should act toward them, um, that just gets them angry, and then that's ultimately self-defeating in terms of their
Right.
life goals. I guess a major life goal would be stay out of prison, right?
Right.
Stay out of jail. So yeah, yeah. So it is kind of self-defeating. Um, One of the things that REBT is kind of known for, and I think cognitive behavioral models in general, is kind of to dispel the myth that situations or events are the major direct cause of our kind of mental emotional disturbance or upsetness, if you would,
Right. Right.
and that instead, which I think is great news, that it's not so much the situation, but largely the way that we're thinking about that situation. And we call that the BC connection, right? Have you found good ways to get that taught in that particular setting to help them become aware of how their thinking is self-sabotaging?
Yes. So I'll sometimes start with the question, simply asking the person, do you believe we have the ability to not control but influence how we feel, our emotions? And a lot of times they'll say no. I feel angry. It's not my fault I felt angry. That person made me angry. This
Yeah.
thing made me angry, right? So it sort of opens the door to that conversation. A lot of times what I think helps get buy-in to this connection is helping them. Nobody likes to feel that they're being manipulated, and a lot of people in jail particularly, they pride themselves on being a strong personality, and I'm in charge, and you can't do something to me because I'm going. And so I help them understand that we talk about triggers. That officer might have triggered something but didn't make you. If you approach the relationship or that interaction in terms of thinking that that officer made you angry, well, you're giving power to that person, right? And
Yeah.
you're basically saying, they're able to manipulate you and they're able to get you to do whatever you want. So phrasing it that way, or framing it that way, I think sometimes helps them realize, you know what, I don't like the idea that I'm letting somebody else manipulate me into, getting into trouble, and now I've lost everything. And the officer is laughing at me, and I'm the one with the consequences. Helping them understand that no, the way you think really does um, have a direct impact on how you feel and how you behave. And it sort of it empowers them, and it helps them understand that they don't need to be a victim. They don't need to be manipulated in that way.
Yeah, well, I think that's really well put. That really, it sounds like what you're helping them do is to reclaim a real power
Yes.
rather than just giving it away for free, and then they take the downside of giving it away for free, right?
Yep. Yep.
They're left with holding the sentence.
Hmm.
So yeah, yeah, really, really claiming a realistic kind of power. Now, there we've been talking about changing cognition, change in the way we're thinking. Now, in REBT, we have like behavioral kinds of things that we can do, emotive kinds of things. Do you find that you're working largely with the cognitive, or do you occasionally go into more behavioral kinds of interventions?
I'd say mostly working on the cognitive.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is that because it tends to be pretty efficient, or
I
for
think.
other reasons?
Yeah, I think it tends to be very efficient. Again, we're working with the reality that they may not be there for very long.
Yeah.
So just to open their eyes to what they can do up here to really create real positive results for themselves. Doing behavioral interventions, they may not be around long enough to really get that going.
Yeah. You remind me of Viktor Frankl, right? Who realized that, I mean, he was in a horrendous situation in the
Right.
concentration camps in the Holocaust, and here he is saying, the last area of freedom that he has, and the control is the way that he was responding to
Yeah.
the horrendous reality around him.
It's interesting you bring that up. I use his work and him so often in therapy to help, and in different ways. But one of the ways is when it comes to the frustration intolerance, right? I can't stand this. And it would be horrible. It would be terrible, and I can't stand it. I couldn't tolerate it, and I have to be careful with this approach. But often it resonates where I'm helping the person understand. Well, you can tolerate it. You would rather not. It will be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It will be distressing, but you can tolerate it. Let's look at other examples of quote unquote intolerable suffering that ultimately was tolerable, right? And what was the difference between those who just sort of perished versus those who persevered, and will to meaning and finding purpose in one's. So I and to my sometimes great surprise, I'll have an inmate who it'll really resonate with the person, and I wouldn't have expected it to.
Huh, amazing.
Maybe somebody who is less educated, or something, or maybe illiterate and not well read, and it'll sometimes have a big impact.
Yeah, and I think there is something that often people miss within REBT. They think, oh, we're not saying that a situation is not awful. We talk about awfulizing, which is the ongoing process of declaring that something is awful and repeatedly doing that. And of
Right.
course, maybe a situation is pretty darn bad. You get COVID, you're locked up. I mean, who would wish that, right?
Right.
Want that? But it's that ongoing process that really messes you up if you're just going to ruminate on that.
Right. You're ruminating. You're obsessing over it. What I'll do sometimes is I'll ask the person, because I can tell they're awfulizing, right?
Yeah.
And so I'll ask them, do you have any? And they'll tell me that all is bad, right? Everything is terrible, and no matter how hard I try, the system keeps me down, and everything is terrible and
Yeah.
horrible. And I'll say, do you have anything positive in your life right now? And they'll tell me, no, nothing. And I'll break it down as basic as I need to, and sometimes I'll say, well, you can see, correct? You can hear. You have your five senses, and we'll talk about what it means to not even have those. People who are paralyzed, and somehow they find a way to persevere and to find, you know, uh, um, meaning in their life. And so, is there anything you can do to accept the bad in your life right now, but also to focus on what you can change, or what good you have?
I love that, Shoval, because in a way, if I have it right, what you're doing is helping them see opportunity in their environment rather than everything as a threat.
Right, right,
Yep.
right. Because when you see it, when you think of everything as a threat, you act accordingly, which then can be very self-destructive and lead to worse problems. When you recognize, and this is what resonates so strongly with me with REBT and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is that our cognitive distortions and our irrational thinking can really be harmful and can really set the stage for further grief and problems. But when our thinking is more reality based, and it's more rational or logical, or then um, then we move from a position of really just ruminating, like you said, in our problems and never moving forward, to moving to a phase where we problem solve, and focusing on what can I change, what can I improve, and what I can't, let me understand it in a more reality based way so that I can accept it better.
This is a more personal question, Shoval. Do you use REBT on you?
I do. I
You
do. I
do.
mean,
Yeah.
it's a great question. Those old hair loss commercials. I'm not only a client, I'm also the president. Or I'm not only the president, I'm also the
Right.
client. Hair Club for Men.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I've been using REBT since before I did the trainings. Um, and it's tremendously helpful. I mean, every now and then I have an anxiety. Somebody might diagnose me with an anxiety disorder. I don't know, but I can kind of get anxious or a little neurotic at times. I blame my mother. Uh, Freud would be so
No, no,
proud.
he would be proud.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, but I do, and the classic example, right? Your boss sends you an email. Can you come to my office? In a few minutes, I want to talk to you. And in your mind, you're starting to race with, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is she going to give me a negative review or chastise me for something I did or didn't do? And then you go down that rabbit hole. And so it's very helpful in stopping that process and really challenging myself. And I mean, I have a lot of self-talk. Again, my whole life, even long before RBT, I would engage in self-talk. But it's to stop that spiral downward, that process, and check in with myself and say, so what? And that's one of the things that I really, and not at all to speak ill of Beck and his his approach to CBT. I think it's wonderful. But one of the things that really resonates with me in REBT over a Beckian CBT is, you know, Beck would say, well, let's look at, what are the chances that your boss, maybe your boss isn't going to chastise you. So, what's the evidence for and against? Um, I don't know. I don't know if they're gonna, they might, right? So I pump myself up and I prepare myself for not being chastised, and ultimately I get there, and that's exactly what happens. It's going to have a much bigger impact. And so one of the things that I love about REBT is that it says, look, so what? So what if I get there and she does chastise me or takes me to task or gives me a negative review? What would that mean to me? Right. And it helps me be much more reality based and to stop that neurotic,
Yeah.
anxious spiral in my head.
Yeah, I love that what if thinking, which it's not really actually when you think about it, it's not the what if that gets us into trouble. That could be brainstorming, right? In a business, it's what follows the what if. Oh
Right.
my gosh, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be horrible. And you're right. The late Arnold Lazarus there at Rutgers said, change your what if to a so what if. Then I guess I'll do this, or I'll do
Right.
that. So it kind of takes away that awfulizing or catastrophizing or the frustration
Absolutely.
and tolerance. So you just cut it off at the pass.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really, really powerful. So you've said that you've taken the primary and the advanced. Where do you see, and not only with REBT, but what kinds of further education do you want, if anything, in psychotherapy?
I mean, it's sort of a broad question. I'll start off with a broad answer. I think that this isn't just paying lip service to it. I think it really is important for all of us in mental health to keep advancing our understanding. And so for me, it's no different. I keep taking. I attend presentations. The other day, I attended a webinar on psychopathy.
Ah,
I wouldn't claim to be an expert in psychopathy, but I'm pretty well versed in it and treating people who have psychopathic traits. But it was an opportunity to learn more about it and to maybe learn a bit more about the scientific background of psychopathy. Um, so generally speaking, I'm constantly looking to take webinars and attend
yeah.
presentations. Um, with REBT in particular, I would like to go on to the next phase of certification. Um, it's we talked about this earlier that I think a lot of, and this is in no way knocking people who say they're CBT therapists without having really taken advanced training in it, but I think a lot of people who practice CBT or who say they practice CBT, um, they're doing it based on, they took a graduate course, for example, maybe they read a book. And in my experience, so many of those people in that category, so many of them, I think, really lack a good understanding of the principles of CBT and how to use the various tools. And that goes for REBT and Becky and CBT. And I think that's the case. And so um, attending the primary and advanced programs at the Institute were very helpful for me in advancing my own knowledge of CBT. And it doesn't end there, but what I would like to do is also be able at some point down the road to not just supervise a therapist in REBT, but to be able to bring as much as I can to that, and so getting more of that foundation at the Institute. But professionally, I'm constantly trying to challenge myself. I've given talks at national conventions on opioid treatment in correctional facilities. I've given national talks. I am the director of our opioid treatment program at our jail.
Oh.
I'm always trying to expand my horizons.
Well, Shoval, thank you so much for taking your time. I know this is time you would be with your family, but I thank you so much for doing it, and it was just a pleasure to get to see you again. It's been quite a long time since I've
Absolutely.
thought.
It's my pleasure. I want to leave one last story, one brief story to illustrate the kind of impact we can have on people. Years ago, when I first got into correctional psychology, I had to change what my notion of therapy and what a therapeutic contact can be. At that point, all I knew about therapy was you do a 45-minute therapy session with somebody. And here I am now in the New Jersey State prison system, and you don't have that. You don't have a 45-minute therapy session. You might have a 5-minute conversation and that's it. And I realized that 5 minutes, a 1 minute interaction can be therapeutic. You're not going to change the person's world. You're not going to, make, some major change to their psychology in that 1 or 5 minutes, but you can have an impact. So that was many years ago. Fast forward to about 2 years ago, there was one inmate in my county jail that I'd seen for evaluations on several occasions and did brief therapy, brief REBT therapy. In my office, I have a whiteboard behind me, and in it, on the whiteboard, I drew a diagram. It's a circular diagram. On top is thoughts. Here is feelings, and over here are behaviors. And there are bi-directional arrows connecting all three, with a red arrow leading specifically from beliefs or thoughts to emotions. Indicating that that's the way I conceptualize it. That mostly it's sort of a top-down. Our beliefs drive how we feel, how we behave, right? The emotional consequences. Anyways. So I drew that on my board, right? And so I'm seeing this inmate several times over the course of about a year. He leaves, he gets released from the jail. About 6 to 8 months later, he comes back. And the officers bring him into my office. The officers bring him in for a new evaluation. And he says, "Doctor," and he's a bright guy, happens to have bipolar disorder, but a very bright guy. And he says, he points to the board and says, "I got that tattoo." And in my mind, I'm thinking, he jailed. He took an ink pen and he drew somewhere on his body. And I said, "Oh, well, great. Okay, have a seat. Let's talk." And he repeats it 1 or 2 more times. I do the evaluation. And at the end, he says it again. "Doctor, I got that tattooed on my wrist." So I said, "Oh, okay. Well, may I see?" This guy went down to Atlantic City after he was last released, and he got tattooed on his wrist the diagram that I had put on my board. And I didn't know whether to be flattered or horrified. But it was a professional tattoo. Whoever did that was more artistic than I am in drawing it on my board. But
Yeah.
it was such a reminder that in just a short amount of time we can have really in his case, a very lasting, permanent, indelible, impression on people. And so that, for me, therapy in general in jail, but REBT in particular, is very helpful because you can really make an impact in someone's how they conceptualize themselves in the world around them and how they see themselves in that context. So I thought I would just share that with you.
That's a fantastic story. I'm going to tell it wherever I am, but I will footnote you, Shoval, when I do that. Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much. But again, I want to thank you for this, and we may need to get you to do something on opioid treatments, right? And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Anytime.
again, thanks so much, and have a good evening.